NBS RP show. My name is Pry. I am the Minister of Culture here in TNP. I am also one of the RP mods for Forum Side. I'm joined today with MJ, lead RP mod, Goy, fellow RP mod.
Hello.
And Tim, aka Essalanea, who is a newbie to Eris, but that's why we wanted to talk to him today.
Hey, how's it going?
So, to get this, and before I forget, much thanks to our delegate, Alfie G. Grand, who is serving as our producer for today's show and the festivities. So thank you, Fiji, for being here. It's much appreciated. So let's get started. Forum RP, Eris. MJ.
Hello.
Broadly speaking, you're in kind of a unique position because you're in control of you're RPing 3 nations, and the Epiphanies is the most recent one. So let's start this off. Tell me all about the Epiphanies. Where are they? Why are they important? And why have they made everyone so goddamn salty?
Because it's really easy to do in answer to that last question. But Epiphanies, who I will admit in my head I've been saying as the Epiphanes, is a nation that originally was called Imperium Augustum and was RP'd by someone who's no longer in TMP, and I took it over because it was an important nation, and he gave me permission. And essentially it's important now with the expansion of the map, because to go through that strait cuts off a massive amount of time for everyone trying to trade with the rest of our RP world.
Mm-hmm.
It's essentially it's a Panama Canal or Suez Canal type situation. If you're not going through that strait, you're adding a whole lot of time and you're making less money. That strait is the most important waterway in Eris. That's why it's important now.
Indeed, it is. Now, you mentioned how when you first took it over, it was controlled by someone else, and when that person left and you took it over, it was not really used for a long time. Like you kind of sat on it because I think there was kind of a group of consensus that no one really knew what to do with it after Grimm left. So when you first started thinking about the IA turned Epiphanies, what was your thought process? What were the first inklings that you wanted to do with it?
The main thought was to Greekify it and get it also being active in a way that was similar to how the last RPer RP'd it, but in a way that was more uniquely me and led to more long-term sustainability of the account and the nation.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing that I'm interested in, and we kind of see this going on in the microphoneless chat, and it's something that I touched on when I kicked this little line of discussion off, why it makes people so salty, and how you've just told Heighton that the Crowned Republic of Heighton is not independent. So what do you mean by that? For those who aren't really initiated into the way that Eris works, how would you explain the way that this government has gone about reintroducing itself to the world? Because I got to admit, I love it.
The main thing to note is that Epiphanes is it's sort of like a Greek title that was applied to various rulers, or that they gave themselves it. It essentially translates to either God Manifest or the Illustrious / Glorious. And that's sort of the attitude the Epiphanes have. Even though they're coming out of this extremely damaging civil war, where their entire, system of government and existing almost ceased, and a religious fundamentalist almost took control. They still believe they are, the most illustrious, the most glorious. They are God manifest. So I sought to take that attitude and apply it to all the other nations in Eris. So my big reintroduction of the nation was them announcing that they were open for embassy exchanges again, and then assigning all the other nations of Eris like a rank. So it was sort of like a certain number of nations were declared like leading nations or empires that the FG Thanes sort of sees as almost equal, but because they're not us, they're not equal. But they're nations that we're not going to actively seek conflict with, and we allow them to keep, several nations around them as part of their sphere of influence and as vassals. The next is nations in their own right, which we'll interact with, we'll negotiate with, but within the guise of we are better than you, and it's quite clearly obvious. This is, it's just an IC thing. People don't have to accept it, and it's not really the case. But that's just the attitude they're bringing in, and it's going to cause problems, and I'm happy to RP those. And then below that are vassal nations, nations that we consider to be vassals of the first group. So, for example, there's a nation called Valand that Syrixia has. We consider that to be a vassal of Andren. Andrensk?
Andren.
Andren, okay. And that is because they have a historical link. They speak sort of the same language. They've got a similar ethnicity. They're linked that way. And because of its location, we decided that okay, we can engage Valant in terms of like we can make deals with them, we can have negotiations with them. But whilst we're doing those deals, it's with one eye on how Andren would react to anything that we do with Valant.
Because you respect that it's Andren's sphere of influence and you don't want to step on their toes in their sphere.
Yes, and then below that are nations or states that we don't recognize at all, because for a variety of reasons they're like failed states, or they're seeking to leave what we consider to be their natural rulers. Like Wondrous nation, Sutherland, is seeking to leave in character Macedonia, which we have, and we just consider them to be rebellious provinces and not a state in itself.
Interesting. And that's what I really like about it, is that it's this willingness to like basically be kind of provocative, but it's in a completely in-character context. And like you said, this doesn't reflect reality. It's just how one government chooses to see the world. But the fact that it's caused so much drama, I think, is absolutely fantastic, because it's got people talking and it's got people debating. But one thing that I want to kind of build off this to get to Goy and Tim here is, you mentioned that when you first took over the IA, you wanted to make it Greek. What reason did you have for that? What was your inspiration to make it Greek?
Latin is a meme and a bit overdone.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
So go for something that is equally ancient but not really done. Mm-hmm. Especially in a way like I'm doing, like, when we think of Greece, we think of, we think mainly of like Athens and Sparta and that sort of era when they were in their ascendancy, and then a little bit later on Alexander. What I've gone pre that, and sort of pre the Greek Dark Ages, to the Minoan Greeks.
Oh, okay.
Who had, especially the ones who were present on Cyprus, who had their own writing script that was more similar to stuff you'd find in what's now Lebanon, with Tyre, which Phoenician script. The Phoenicians, yeah. And I just thought that was a more interesting thing than just going, "Oh, I'm Eris Greece."
Mm-hmm.
Because whilst people can do that, I think it's more interesting, and it gives you a whole, a whole another way to world build if you're taking something either entirely original, and I've got massive respect for anyone who can come up with like entirely original languages and entirely original writing scripts and stuff like that. But not everyone can do that, and I'm part of that group. Or if you're taking something that's not really that well known.
Indeed. Very much indeed. And that's kind of what I wanted to expand into it. Goy, Tim, you guys, I want to get you guys in on it. Kind of building off of MJ's inspiration for why he decided to not just go Greek, but kind of go an older form of Greek. I'm not sure which one to start with here. Let's go with Tim. Sorry, Goy. We'll get to
No worries.
We'll get to you in a bit, but Tim is kind of a new face on air, so I kind of want to get to him in a bit. I want to get to him here. What was your inspiration? Because you've got Essalanea, you've also got Astragon, and I'm curious as to your real life inspirations. What kind of drove you to develop both of those states the way that you have?
Well, I've been role-playing nations for a couple of years now, and it's always kind of been a mix of, on the one hand, it's usually a particular cultural or historical period will fascinate me, and I want to kind of put elements of that into an RP nation. So Essalanea comes from my fascination with the Mongols, and also from kind of Germanic tribes during the sort of Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
Astragon, on the other hand, is a weird mesh of, Astragon is like if Safavid Persia, Ethiopia, and the Padishah Empire from Dune had a baby. Because it's just peppered with lots of different ideas and kind of references, some real, some kind of fictional. But usually also, like, when I'm designing a fantasy nation, it'll be based on kind of my desire to sort of do something interesting but also different. So with Essalanea, I wanted to sort of explore different kind of societal mechanics. So one thing that was really funny when I was designing Essalanea's economic system, collective capitalism, was how confused people got within like 5 seconds. People were like, so you don't have any personal property? You're communist? And I'm like, no, it's just capitalism in a collective format. So Essalanea was very much a desire to make a culture that was very tribal, very clannish, but also had never been colonized, never kind of been sort of turned into someone else's vassal. And I wanted to sort of design Essalanea to be, what would a tribal nation look like if it had been independent up until the modern period? And Astragon is a similar kind of concept. It's what would an empire like the Safavid Persians look like if they were still around today,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, it's just fascinating because, Tim, when you kind of first pitched me an idea for a secondary nation in a DM, and obviously that was for a kind of a different kind of nation, although I see a lot of it in Astragon still. Although it has just been really fascinating to see it evolve from that concept into what it currently is. You mentioned, though, that with Astragon there was a bit of Dune influence. If you don't mind me asking, what sort of fictional inspirations do you draw from? I mean, we of course, I think everyone who kind of does national roleplay in NS context has periods of history that they find interesting and fascinating, and that sort of informs how they RP or what kind of nation they make. But fictional inspiration, I think, is also very important. And I was just curious because you mentioned Dune. Are there any other particular works of fiction or genres that you like to draw on?
I mean, obviously, Dune is kind of my favorite, and I pepper Dune references into almost every empire I ever build. In terms of other references, oh god, I'm just gonna say I do occasionally have some kind of influence from 40k,
Mhm.
Warhammer 40,000 shoved in somewhere. That kind of darker kind of narrative for a nation is often quite compelling. And I suppose things like Blade Runner and The Wheel of Time, I kind of like any fiction that kind of doesn't just discuss what life is like from the top, but also kind of goes into the sort of nitty gritty of life on the sort of ground in any society, is liable to be used. Yeah, I really like fiction that goes into sort of daily life. And often now I'll use kind of influences like that for designing kind of the lower classes of my society, because I think those are as fascinating as the people in the palaces.
Indeed, and you kind of see that even with your work in the 2000 Years RP that Sirixia is hosting, where you even have your leaders there who obviously would be represented at like the top of society, but even then you get it's a very nice slice of lifestyle writing that you kind of engage in, which is fascinating. Uh, moving on though, Goy, your inspirations. What do you like to look for when you're creating an RP nation? Because you've got two here, Ascalon and Goyanes. What sort of things do you like to draw from?
Well, starting with Goyanes. Goyanes is, well, on the surface it seems like a just sort of like a large Norway, but when you look deeper into Goyanes, there's a lot of influences. There's America, Canada, Norway, Germany, and to an extent Japan as well. Um, it's sort of just various elements that I like from society, and I've sort of from various societies around the world, and I've sort of meshed them together to create Goyanes. Um, I what I took was a lot of things that made countries efficient to say per se.
Mhm.
So if you notice, a lot of things in Goyanes are very efficient. Like a lot of designs are efficient, things like that. And I think that stems to a personal enjoyment of mine for things to be as efficient as they possibly can, like to avoid all necessary wastes of time and things like that. So even though I must say, nation states is probably the biggest waste of time I've ever spent on in my life, but it's probably the most fulfilling. Um, but yeah, it's just in general, Goyanes is like things I find pleasing from the real world, and I try to integrate it into Goyanes. Ascalon, on the other hand, stems from a more personal aspect of mine. Ascalon is a Chinese nation in, well, sort of in the aspects that they speak the Chinese language, Mandarin Chinese, and all that.
Mhm.
But the culture is a bit more. I'm not Chinese, but the culture is sort of similar to Cuba and the cuisine as well. Um, so I have a chance to port my personal family experiences into Ascalon, and sort of the way people eat and act around family members and all that.
That's fascinating, and yeah, that's kind of something I've been I've had somewhat of an opportunity to do with Prydania. It's something that I kind of want to explore more often. I've got, for example, I've got Prydania and I've got Aurelia, and those two happen to reflect kind of both sides of my heritage. Prydania is a Nordic country; it's very Northern European, and I've got part of my family that reflects, and then the other side of my family, is Jewish, and so Aurelia kind of reflects that. And I've kind of realized I'm in this opportunity where, because of that, I can sort of use Prydania to explore concepts of, Jewish identity and how that relates to ethnic identity and that kind of stuff. I've done a bit of it with my For the King 2 Valhalla solo RP. I did a bit kind of dealing with the Shadaiist history in Prydania and how that has not necessarily always been the best thing, and kind of delved into those themes, and I kind of want to do more of it. So I definitely understand how, like, looking at your own family's history and being like, how can we explore these themes, right? How can we what's the inspiration for it? And I think in a way it's really cathartic in my experience. In my experience, like, a lot of these topics get very heavy, and a lot of these topics can be very emotional. And being able to sort of use a fictional universe almost as a basis, and just kind of thinking it through and exploring these concepts as a work of fiction, it kind of helps you visualize a lot of these issues that, your own community or your own family, might be dealing with. But kind of moving along, I want to I started with MJ and I ended with Goy. I'm going to start with Goy now, and we're going to move back to MJ. Tim is stuck in the middle. Sorry, Tim.
All right.
But Goy, we were talking about, inspiration and what drives us. And the one thing that I really wanted to talk about was we're going to move into world building.
Oh boy.
And there's been a joke that you are sort of like the god of world building, and I say that with complete envy and awe. And I'm just kind of curious, like, you mentioned efficiency. What sort of, besides that, what would you say are your major inspirations, Goy, when you decide to world build to the extent that you have? Because you've obviously done a lot of very extensive work, and it's very, very impressive, but I'm curious as to what is it that, initiates that spark of creativity that lets you go?
So a lot of it is real life experience, not per se sort of like family stuff, like, but the more mundane things that we do in our daily lives. Like, so for example, let's say I go, I don't know, clothes shopping at a department store. When I come home, I'm gonna log on to my laptop and maybe flesh out what a department store in Goyanes is like, for example. I get a lot of my inspiration from that, and I tend to go into a lot of tangents on things and, like, sort of, go into more detail than necessary, but for some reason I just don't feel like I can leave it alone until I've fleshed out everything that I feel is necessary, even if it's, the smallest thing ever,
I remembered at one point, Lore, our cartography for Eris, dared you to make a sock, like just like what would a Goyanian sock package look like? And I remember in a while you came back and you were just like, "Get wrecked, Lore. Here you go." And it was.
I actually have that right here.
Yeah, I mean,
microphone-less for everybody to see.
But I've noticed something, particularly, and this is, I think, what I find so appealing about a lot of the stuff that you do go away from a world building perspective is I think you and I have similar tastes, and I hesitate to fully use the term cassette futurism, but I think you and I have the same appreciation for a broadly 1980s aesthetic, and
Yeah.
and I really enjoy when I see that play out in your world building, Goy. Just as a example, just pull something up that I have here. This is the emblem for a car company in Prydania, which my friend Sovereign Dixie, who was actually a kid in the 80s, just was like, dude, I
Like
could hear
you.
the. I'm not that old. I was a baby in the 80s, not a kid. But he saw that. He's like, dude, I can hear the synth music playing already in the commercial. So
All you need is like the like as the M moves across the screen, leaves like a rainbow trail behind it.
exactly. And I think that's. Oh, sorry.
No. Continue. Sorry.
I was just like, I really do appreciate that. Just sort of this mundane kind of nature, and it's been something that I think a lot of people in Eris have talked about, and it's been a debate. I've had this debate with other mods. I've had this debate with other RPers who aren't mods, and sort of like, do we let the world building get too far? Is it like, are we world building at the expense of story? And like, I think honestly, I've kind of shifted around on that position. I think I'm kind of currently in this very happy position where it's like, I don't think it does necessarily, because like, I don't world build nearly to the extent that you do, Goy, but like, when I do, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's probably never going to factor into something that I will write. But at the same time, I mean, like, I made a Prydanian Village Inn logo, for crying out loud. I can't foresee Thorpe Craw. I cannot for the life of me foresee an instance where that's actually going to be something of significance. But in my opinion, kind of doing a lot of that small stuff, a lot of that small scale stuff, it really kind of gets me in the mood to write a lot of the more character-driven stuff that I find very enjoyable. And it's sort of this idea. It's like, yeah, this thing I created is probably going to reference something that will never appear in anything I write. But the fact that I enjoyed making it and I enjoyed fleshing out this world a bit more makes me more eager to then do something really cool writing-wise in it.
Yeah.
So.
I totally agree with you. I see world building, and especially world building mundane minutia. It's not so much that I need it for a story. If I need it for a story, sure, I will sit down and I will world build the hell out of it. But doing this stuff, it makes at least to me, it makes Goyanes seem less like some words on a page and more and more realistic in my mind. Like I could imagine it being an actual country on Earth. But that's just my own personal sort of satisfaction that I derive from it.
Very well said. Very well said. Tim, when I've noticed that you kind of have your own style in relation to Goy, but yours seems more narratively driven. But something that I've found very, very interesting and very fun to read is that when I read your stuff, like, you are so good with detail that you kind of just pack it all in there. You really do know how to make any particular scene you're writing come alive, and that in and of itself is kind of a form of world building because you kind of inform the scene. So I was just kind of curious, like, when you're thinking about how to flesh out your RP worlds and your nation, or even just a scene that you're writing, what's your process? What do you think about?
I mean, obviously, I'm an absolute awe of Goy and some of the guys who can make these amazing kind of world building elements like banknotes and signs and all that sort of stuff. I'm not as talented on the design aspect, so one thing I do try and do is, I mean, the first thing with a scene is I want to know. Well, obviously, I want to take the reader there, so I want the reader to know what's going on. What the place looks like, maybe what things smell like, what kind of, if it's hot, if it's cold. You want to kind of pull the reader in with those little details about the world around the characters. And then there's also the internal element. You want to, well, I find it more interesting than anything else to sort of take you inside the characters' heads, get into their motivations, what they're thinking, what they're feeling internally. Because I think one thing I've noticed in some of my older nations, pre kind of North Pacific, was a tendency to sort of just have these static figures who didn't feel very human. And nowadays, I want my characters to be really kind of relatable and interesting because they are human and they do have kind of emotions and needs and desires. So I try to go with a really humanistic style writing stance. More than anything, I want to have that personal voice coming through with these characters. So there is a lot of kind of, back and forth between what they're saying and also what they're thinking. And also, funnily enough, things like food and scent come into it a lot as well. I have one character, Ulrich, who is he's a mix of comic relief and seriousness, but almost every scene starts with him eating something and someone else rolling their eyes. And I think that kind of personal touch is quite humanizing and it makes the characters more believable.
Very well said. Very well said. I tend to agree with that kind of style of writing and character development. I'm curious. A lot of my own process when it comes to doing that is I kind of like to flesh out characters that I write before I put digital pen to paper, I guess, and it's kind of a weird thing because, of course, any character that you conceive of is going to flesh themselves out as you write them. Like you're going to figure out ways in which it makes more sense for them to act than maybe you had previously thought, and you might tweak this, that, or the other thing as you think about it as you write. But broadly, I like to start with a very good idea of what their history is, what they've been through, how they were raised, what informs their opinions on certain topics. That's particularly poignant when it comes to national based RP, nation states based RP. And so, but like for me, like if you ask me about almost any character that I've written in TNP, I've probably got like at least a couple paragraphs worth of information on any of them. That's just the most mundane, irrelevant crap that applies to them that I will probably never include in an RP post because it's just that unimportant. But at the same time, it's like, well, this informs the character. This informs how they view the world. And if I'm going to be writing something, if I want to get inside their head and understand how they understand it, like all of that stuff becomes important. All of that stuff becomes vital. And I was just curious because I think you and I kind of have a same outward style in that regard, Tim. And I was just curious if you like to go to that extent that I do, or if I'm just alone in that insanity.
No, I agree totally. I think a lot of the irrelevant stuff that we never really use is actually really important because, I mean, I'm fairly certain most authors, most writers, are kind of in a sense inhabiting the character as they're writing, trying to kind of get into the mindset of that character. And so you need to know these small details about them. So yeah, I do have kind of quite solid ideas now, as I've kind of written the characters about their sort of habits and personalities. Although I do find some of the coolest aspects of my characters have actually come about almost accidentally and become like set things. So Ulrich always eating, Geiseric being obsessed with wine and having a glass of wine in his hand in almost every scene. Those were things that kind of evolved quite organically. And discussions with other role players on the server actually kind of influenced that quite a lot as well. So I think it's kind of 70-30 in terms of percentage. So like, yeah, I have a really strong idea of what my characters are like and their habits, but and certainly their background. But there's also that kind of unexpected 30% of their characterization, which kind of has just evolved over time. Things that have just stuck. Because the first scene which Ulrich appeared in was him walking up a street, chewing on a kebab. And that kind of just became a joke that just kept going, and which I have no intention of stopping. So yeah, it's a mix.
Yeah, I kind of had something with that. I had a character who he started off, and he still is, Prydania's ambassador to Norcia, Sonny Kofed, and he's a legend. But the thing about Sonny that was really interesting was when I first wrote him, like, there's always this thing where you want to give characters something to do, so you can fill in the space between their dialogue, so it's just not he said, she said, he said, she said. Like, you want to give them you want to give them little things to do. Now, a good writer will think of things to vary up. Think of different things to vary that they'll do. And I admit that when I first wrote Sonny Kofed, I kind of failed in that regard because I gave him a glass of liquor and I just kept having him sip from the cup, from the glass. And ideally, I would have changed that up, but I didn't. But I turned lemons into lemonade by just kind of making him a high-functioning alcoholic, and it's been a thing that's like... it's been like a thing that's like stuck with the character now, and honestly, I mean, that was honestly a blessing in disguise, because like Sonny Kofed was one of these characters who, I mean, I got his name from a bloody, name generator, right? That shows you how much that, he was not a character that I had put a lot of thought into. I needed a name, and I needed a character to be Prydania's ambassador to Norcia, and I got the name Sonny Kofed, and I wrote that first post, and he's been that ever since. And I mean, not to endorse alcoholism, but it did kind of give me something of an idea. It gave me an idea for this character to have an identity, and it was just purely because I kind of failed as a writer.
But sometimes failure leads to success. Honestly, Sonny Kofed, my image of him is just of this kind of middle-aged dude with Ray-Bans, constantly with liquor in his glass. He's just a meme, a walking meme. He's brilliant.
Indeed, it's been so fun. It's been so fun. But to move on and to mention something that Mad Jack dropped in the chat, Mobutu fucking Jones. MJ, tell us about Mobutu Jones.
Mobutu Jones is because I wanted to RP an African dictator just because. At the time, every nation on Eris, or almost every nation, I'd say like 99%, was white, European. Half of them were German or German analogs, which is fine. You can RP whatever you want as long as you make it good. I think Sear was the only exception to this. Like Sorixia is Indians who think they're British. But I wanted to RP a nation that was different. So why not an oil and mineral rich failed African state with a Haile Selassie, Idi Amin type figure. And Boto Jones was the reaction to that. And having a character that could just go off on other nations and call out what he assumed as imperialism or hypocrisy, or just have any reason to rail against established powers. That was a fun thing to do. And Sasson just said in the chat, air gangsterism. Just to briefly go off of RP, but it's a thing I took from Milograd, who was the best RP Ennis has ever seen. But he was also in gameplay, and he queued TSP at one time. And his coup, the theme of his coup was like Enza Hoxha's Albanian communism. And one of the big memes to come out of that was their opponents were called air gangsters. Well, the way I applied that in Eris was that Boto Jones was calling nations air gangsters as they were so imperialistic they'd colonize the air you breathe.
Well, kind of just going off of that, you've got, like, I mentioned that you're kind of in a unique position, MJ, in that you RP3 nations, and you don't just RP3 nations, they're three very, very distinct nations. Gottmark is this, Scandinavian, Northern European monarchy. Niger is, as you said, it's this mineral-rich African state. And I'm always going to butcher the name. The Epiphanes is, as you said, this kind of like Greek. It's like this imperial Greek state, but like really old Greek. And it seems like there's a lot of variety there. So I guess I've been talking to Tim about their influences. I'm curious as to yours, because you already delved into a bit of Niger's, but like from a broad point of view, what would you say your influences are when you get down to world building?
Fluff. It's 90% of my world building is based on fluff. I'd say a good 60% of my actions in an OOC sense, in like setting up international organizations, coming up with like airlines and stuff like that, is so I can reference it back in my RP. So the way I write, my life is writer's block. So I get around that with just stream of consciousness writing. I don't think about what I'm writing, I just write whatever comes to me. I then go back to that and fix things, erase things, edit myself, basically. And the more fluff I can put into that, the more things I can refer to, the more bulked out my writing is. So META, the Metarian Economic Treaty Organization, or Association even, that was started so that I could refer to something in a news report, for an RP, for like one post, and no one's ever going to think of that again. It's evolved to something else, but it was... Sear just took me right out my what I was saying.
Well, I remember at one point you said that like meta, like the origin of meta in universe was that it was to standardize Materan wall sockets.
Yes, it was, and like that was something I just could refer to in an RP post and never think about again, or like just refer to like there's a character in a room, there's a television on, it's showing the news. The news report is talking about ongoing meta standardization efforts, and then I go into what the actual story's about. And it's just stuff to refer back to. That I think I'm different in terms of my world building, in that my world building isn't going to be very precise. It's not going to be very, it's not going to be very expansive. It's going to be what can I use in an RP post in 3 weeks' time, or 3 months' time?
That's that's actually very well said and very. I think it's a position that a lot of people honestly should probably take a bit more to heart. I kind of going off about how you mentioned, meta is just a thing to reference, and it's fluff. It's there to fill out the world, and you reference it, and then you move on. I think that's honestly, and of course, you didn't intend for it to be this, but it grew into an actual alliance of nations in character. But I think that core really does drive a lot of how we should view alliances in Eris, because I get the sense like there seems to be this mentality among Eris RP where it's like, oh, if an alliance hasn't seen a lot of activity lately, that must mean it's dead. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. Like we can assume that any multinational alliance in Eris has scores of bureaucrats and committees meeting, doing things that even like we don't all have to RP out, right? Like
yeah, it's essentially like 99% of like the work done at the UN like General Assembly is done behind closed doors, and most of that is going to be really, really boring stuff. Arguments over wording of resolutions, how resolutions are going to be, applied, stuff like that. Nobody wants to RP that. Nobody wants to RP, deciding whether Type G or Type H wall sockets are the best ones. Nobody wants to RP, whether phones should use all the same connection.
Mm-hmm.
Like that sort of thing isn't something anybody's interested to RP. But if I can refer to that back and say it's going on, Meta has a standardization committee, so I can then refer to any number of things in a later RP post that the Meta standardization committee is considering or has done. Or maybe I can put something in like, maybe there's construction workers like dealing with something nearby that's as a result of changes done by this Meta standardization committee.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that, like, as far as Alliance RP goes, like, we should all just be content, just sort of be like, when we talk, when RP actually happens in an Alliance thread, we can assume that's like the big, really important stuff. But just because nothing is happening doesn't mean that, nothing is happening in character-wise. So, I don't know. I think it's a really healthy attitude because alliances add much-needed fluff, and fluff is good. Fluff is never a bad thing. And I think we strain ourselves unfairly when we're like, is the alliance has been inactive for too long, we must do a thing. It's like, no, we can just leave it alone. And if something comes up that we need to talk about in it, then we'll do that. But let's just leave it alone and just let it be part of the background, I guess. No, we're sitting there in silence as Yalkin says, that would be fucking great. I would love to do that. Just have nothing happen in the PGU. Just have nothing happen in the
Jordan
PGU.
Arnaud stands and just in silence and then sits back down, and everybody just nods in agreement.
Yes. or like we just don't do anything in the PGU for like weeks upon weeks, and then we finally come back and do a thing, and we all RP it as if our characters have been sitting there in absolute silence. Like, and just be like, yeah, that, we've been sitting here for like 2 weeks, guys. It's like, yeah, I mean, but just acknowledge it and then move past it. Like, that would be amazing. But I guess now I guess the thing is that that I wanted to get into, and we've kind of touched on it a lot, but I think we have room to go into something that is a bit more substantial. Uh, the types of RP. I will admit freely that there's some RP that I have no interest in. I practically groan anytime someone asks me, what's my GDP? Like, because I don't know. And I put myself in a bad spot with Prydania, because Prydania is just coming out of a civil war. So, like, the ideal of what Prydania's GDP in an optimal situation is not matching what its GDP would be now. But if I put what the GDP is now, it's improving. So that's not going to be a number that lasts for very long. It's a really big mess. But so stuff like economic RP bores me to tears. I like a lot of character-driven work. And that's sort of the attitude that I take. And that's kind of what I excel in, what I enjoy writing. I was curious now, working back along, MJ, what sort of RP really inspires you? Like, what kind of story are you most interested in writing? What about Eris makes you come back and say, I want to write in this world?
First, I have to ask, what's the climate of Beaconsfield?
The climate of Beaconsfield is standard for kind of Northern European. It's quite pleasant in the spring and summer. It gets chilly in the fall, and it's basically a frozen wasteland come winter. And that's the climate of Beaconsfield. I refer you to my thread, The City of Beaconsfield, in the National Information section of the Forum RP subforum, because I include a climate graph there. So if anyone's curious about the climate in regards to Beaconsfield, they can go to that post, they can go to that thread, and they can see that. And I'm hopeful that that will solve everyone's curiosity on the matter. No, it won't. But yeah, MJ, when you're writing, like what kind of RP would you say is your wheelhouse?
I'm definitely more character RP than anything else. I feel like character RP is the best vehicle for me to get across, how both the actions of people and the actions of nations. If I can tell a story of, say, a military assault, but through the eyes of, a soldier or a group of soldiers, that to me is more interesting than just saying, the forces have got advanced into Valand and won the war.
As such a war, we know that's how that war would go. Gotmark would beat Valand.
Yes. So interactions between people, or people questioning just themselves, and just like taking a character on a journey through XYZ is it's more interesting to me than macro RP, so to speak. I'm with you on the economic stuff. I couldn't care less what my GDP is. Couldn't care less what my government budget is. We have enough money to do the things that I want to do in RP.
That's I'm shocked that I've been here coming up on 2 years now, and I have never once made a Prydanian or Aurelian government budget. I'm kind of shocked, but I'm also very pleasantly surprised that I haven't, and I want to keep that streak.
Yeah, like I know, like maybe at some point I should do that, but at the same time, it doesn't interest me. It's not something that I feel I could put the kind of attention into that I do with, say, an RP post or a news article. I do a lot of news articles. I will say that. It's character RP and just news articles. Basically for me. they're easier ways, I find, to get what I want to RP across. Yeah.
No, that's fair enough. Fair enough, and yeah, I'm in agreement with you on the character stuff. That's kind of what I gravitate towards. Tim. I can see that you tend to skew towards the character side as well, just by reading your stuff. But I'm curious as to, what sort of stories do you enjoy telling, per se? Like, what sparks that interest where you kind of go, I'm gonna log onto the forums today and I'm gonna write this post? What is the spark? What is your preference, I suppose?
So with me, the two things that really get me excited are conflict and life. So what I mean by that is I like writing about things like wars, political strife, political wheeling dealing. I like the kind of stuff that goes wrong in a society that's really interesting.
Mhm.
But also, and Heighton's just mentioned that Essalanea has had civil wars over cell service. So I really like.
I've heard of worse reasons. To be fair, I've heard of worse reasons.
3G causes a lot of trouble. But so yeah, I like kind of the darker stuff that goes on in society, but I also like just the interesting stuff that goes on in people's day-to-day lives, and I think the two things mesh really well.
Mhm.
I like my city scenes. I like where a main character is walking through a street and you get to get a fix on what the smells are, what people are doing, what are people drinking, what are people selling, what the buildings look like. So I like to explore what people do in their day-to-day lives. I really like the common person's aspect, but I also love having like full-on motorbike charges in Essalanea with people getting beheaded and trampled. That's fun too.
Mhm.
I think the unifying theme is similar to you guys. I like characters. I think characters are the vehicles through which the best stories are told, in my opinion. But definitely, it's kind of a mix. It's normalcy, kind of the normal things people do in these countries. I think that's really important, and we often overlook it. But also this kind of, what happens when things go horribly wrong.
Mhm.
What happens when people fight, when there's strife in the streets. That's always really fun.
It reminds me of a guy I knew in university whose interest was the early Middle Ages. Like, we're talking, like, he focused on like the decades, maybe a century or two, following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. And he summed up his interests and his course of study saying, like, I love to study when things go wrong and when the apocalypse happens. And that's just sort of brought that to mind. But Goy, what would you say, what kind of roleplay would you say is your most preferred? What would you say your wheelhouse is when it comes to what you're writing, what you're putting out there? What inspires you to write something on the forums? Because as we all know, nothing on the Discord is canon until it's on the forums.
I know. Oh, I do stalk the TMPRP Discord, but sort of I like all RP. I'm just gonna say it. Jack of all trades, master of none. But if there's any RP that I'm flattered. But if there is a sort of genre, I guess, that really keeps me on the edge of my seat, it's probably the sort of diplomatic intrigue.
Mm-hmm.
So sort of what is happening in the Epiphanes right now, and in Sutherland, that sort of stuff. It keeps me on my toes because I can do not just character RP with numerous people, prime ministers, soldiers, diplomats, all that. I can also roleplay the actions of my entire nation.
Mhm.
So I can really show how like the gears are turning to make the greater machine of Goyanes work.
Yeah, I noticed something that was quite interesting when you and I did a collaboration in my first real thread in TMP Over the Hills and Back. Like, we did a thing where a character of mine teamed up with a Goyanian army sergeant, and it was really interesting how sort of the character work and the how the character work and the sort of intrigue side of it, sort of the I guess political thriller side of it, kind of intersected. And I'm always really interested. I'm always really impressed with that kind of stuff, especially what you did in that collaboration, Goy, because like I've been RPing for a while now, and so I kind of pick up on trends because I've been doing this long enough. I understand how it kind of works, and like I think I could tell you fairly certainly, and not just you, Goy, but this goes for almost anyone because I've just been doing this for so long, that I know the difference between a character who's sort of someone's one of someone's main characters versus like a character they made up for the scene, which always happens. It's unavoidable, and I kind of got that sense that was that Goyanian sergeant was sort of someone that you created for the RP. He really wasn't someone who was all that important in your overall, the overall quote unquote story that you were telling. But what I loved about it was that, like, despite that happening, like, you pretty much had the guy nailed from go, which I thought was great.
I think what helps me nail sort of these characters is that I base my characters off of people I know in real life, and they don't necessarily have to be, people I'm extremely acquainted to. It could be more public figures, but it helps me sort of know what I'm aiming for. And sometimes they're not always, just one person. Sometimes they're meshes of different people. So I can sort of, when I role playing this person, I'm sort of just like, I put myself in their shoes for a second, and I think it allows me to sort of make that character more more realistic, see more than just a creation for this RP.
Indeed, and I also really liked how you kind of expanded on some of the stuff that we did in Over the Hills and Back, which, yes, as Seer pointed out, won an award. Thank you very much. But it how you kind of then expanded that into the Prydanian 8 extradition story, which was really, really cool. And like, again, just off the top of my head, when I started RPing here again, just a bit shy of 2 years at this point. It's going to be 2 years and about a little over a month. But what I particularly love, Goy, is that I've seen you personally improve a great deal in that time.
Thank you.
And you did a lot of good stuff in Over the Hills and Back, but when you kind of revisited that stuff in extradition, the extradition Prydanian 8 storyline, I was like, wow. That was like, which was also really cool because that had been like, at that point, I think it had been like a year and a half since Over the Hills and Back, and you kind of just picked it up. It was kind of something I had assumed was, these story threads were done, we finished the thread, it was done, it was good, but we were moving on. And then you were like, no, like, there's probably something interesting here, and you explored it, and we're like, well, what if there was just this group of soldiers who just, did something like just absolutely horrible. But what was great about it was, like, you kind of understood where they're coming from, but it's still a very bad thing.
Yeah, I even when I was writing the Prydanian 8, I was very emotionally conflicted, because on one hand you have these people who, you know, they emigrated when they were young because of what was going on in Prydania, and then on the other hand you have somebody who was, you know, complicit in a brutal terrorist regime, and you find yourself supporting both of these people at different times in the story.
Indeed, and I was trying to reflect that when I wrote Toby's response to that and how he kind of dealt with that, because I mean, geez, I love that thread because I think it's so. I mean, it's only a short thread. It's only two posts. It's the setup that you provided, and then I just sort of provided the Prydanian reaction through Toby, and that's all it really needed to be. But what I really love about it is that it's so morally conflicted, and I mean, okay, I'm going to admit that subversion of expectations is never really my favorite type of thing when it comes to fiction, because I don't have a problem with it in and of itself, but it's really easy to do lazily. Like, if you just like defaulting to what people don't expect is just as lazy as just doing what people expect. And so just being different for the sake of being different, or being, you know, controversial just for the sake of being controversial, doesn't really do it for me, because it's just as easy and empty to do as writing a Mary Sue. But at the same time, so in that regard, I tend to have my preferences for very traditional things, kind of going back to an earlier conversation, my own influences in RP outside of history, outside of the periods of history that I find interesting, are fantasy. And not just fantasy, but very specific kind of fantasy. It's the Arthurian mythos. It's Beowulf. It's J.R.R. Tolkien, and the kind of stuff that he was able to pull from old Viking sagas. You know, a lot of that stuff, and a lot of that stuff kind of lends itself to very traditional narratives. Probably the main character of Prydanian RP is Toby, King Tobias III of Prydania, and his story is very much a standard hero's journey story. There's not much shocking there, but I think that's what I like. I find it compelling, and I think it can still be a compelling narrative if told right. So I run with it. But because, again, I don't find that much value in being subversive just for the sake of it. But what I really loved about the Extradition RP that you did, Goy, and I hope that I was able to contribute to that feeling in some way, was just this idea that, you know, we all kind of have our preconceived notions of, you know, who's in the right and who's in the wrong in our own overall narratives. But, you know, even then, even within like our own imaginations as we're fleshing this out, like, it's never quite so simple. And
Yeah.
Oh, quick answer to Fiji's question. Toby's last name is Lothbrok. Lothbrok. It's taken from a Viking saga, the story of Ragnar Lothbrok, who was a legendary king of Denmark, or potentially Norway. It gets confusing because early Scandinavian history is a mess and places mean multiple things. But yeah, I really liked the name Ragnar. I really liked the surname Lothbrok, so I just kind of stole it for the Prydanian royal family. So yes, I'm going to yes, VG. I was waiting for an opening to get to Sear's question. Sear's question basically goes back to what I mentioned to Goy, that, you know, I've been doing this RP thing long enough that I can sort of tell when a character is in someone's main stable of main characters versus when someone is kind of made up for a scene or just kind of created on the spot to fill a role. And Seer is just kind of curious as to what I kind of use to differentiate the two types. And I mean, it's honestly there's really no like checklist of things to go down. It's more just almost kind of like a gut feeling, just the way that people introduce characters, I feel is telling. There's always slightly less of an emphasis on a character's introduction if they're not intended to be, you know, an overarching main character of an RPer. Also, you like to look at how what types of characters RPers tend to prefer. So a soldier, right, who's like a non-commissioned officer, he's not a commissioned officer, right? Just, you know, regular soldier. Whether or not I'm going to think he's someone's main character or part of someone's stable of main characters is going to depend on what other characters they have. So it's really just a point. It's really just paying attention, right? Paying attention to someone's habits, the kind of characters that they write, the kind of characters that they like to write, and if someone fits, you know, if someone fits or not. But I think that's a really good question, and I think it's something that I want to kind of go through the list one more time before we wrap the show up. So I'm gonna start. I believe we started with MJ and went to Goy, so we're gonna start with Goy and then work back to MJ, and then we'll wrap this up. One last discussion question, I guess. In terms of that character who, you know, is not someone who is your main character, that character who is, I guess, you create this character on the spot because you need a name or you need a character to fill a specific role, and you really haven't thought about them much before. You really haven't world built their past up much. They're just sort of created on the spot, and maybe they stick around and maybe they don't. But they were kind of a spontaneous creation. I'm kind of curious as to how everyone goes about dealing with that, because it's something that I've kind of noticed is I won't say a trial for our peers, but it's one of those universal problems, I think, that our peers all constantly have to deal with. And I'm just kind of curious how our panel here handles that. So I'll start with Goy. What's your process broadly if you find yourself in an RP and you need a body and you need a name? How do you go about it?
So it depends on the situation sometimes. It always depends on the situation. I see what's going on in the story. I see where I need to insert this character, and the name, finding a name, you know, I could just go to a name generator for that, but giving them the personality is really where the thick of it lies. And with these people, I sort of, like I said earlier, a lot of my characters are analogs of people I know in real life or people who I have seen acting in real life. So I try to find someone or a combination of someone of people who would fit this character well, and I sort of just create this character. And my philosophy is, with a lot of the times with these sort of characters you make up for RPs, is, you know, it's sort of a funny meme from the Clone Wars, from Star Wars: The Clone Wars, the animated TV show on Cartoon Network. There was in one of the first episodes, Master Jedi Plo Koon was floating in space with 3 other clone troopers, and the clone trooper said, "Sir, we're meant to be expendable." Plo Koon responded, "Not to me." So that's the logic and sort of philosophy I apply to these sort of characters. If I'm going to insert a character into an RP, I think I should give them the whole 9 miles, everything they need. I'll give them a background. I'll give them a personality, just so they're not just a normal non-playable character there in a story. There's something you can interact with, and a lot of the times when an RP is open, if I have a character that I and take that opportunity and make them do more things than just sort of stand around and do something.
Mm-hmm. Very well said. Very well said. Tim, you find yourself at an RP. You realize that there is a character that you need to create on the spot. How do you go about doing it?
Well, you've only got a limited. If it's just like a one scene character, like someone who's going to be there for a purpose. If I'm going by the assumption that they're not going to be a big part of the narrative, but they're going to serve an important role, I think I go towards kind of the small details with those characters. Like Goy said, you don't want to kind of just have an expendable character that you have in there and you just don't detail very well and they just become a faceless throwaway. For example, like I like little details. Like usually characters that I bring in are, depending on the context, they might be working or sat around doing something or whatever the case. You want to kind of work in small details because I think small details really bring a character to life. So like if say you have a character who's a watchman and like he's going to be the guy who spots the invading force that's about to teetotal the city. I'll have things like, what's he doing? Maybe he's stiff because he's old and his joints are sore. He's pissed off because his coffee's gone cold. You just want little details and little habits that will kind of flesh out this character, because I think if you give a little bit of information, it goes a long way with a character. Their habits, their likes, their dislikes, how they feel about the environment and role they're in. These sorts of things, you don't have to like completely reveal everything about the character, but if you kind of hint at things and give little details here and there, it goes a long way, and it makes the character more believable.
Mm-hmm. Very very well articulated. That's we always kind of want to make sure that people don't just end up as stick figures, right? And just the smallest little details can bring anyone to life. But finishing up with MJ, how do you deal with that if you need a throwaway character? What's your process?
It's come up with a name. Come up with the parent's name if it's in terms of Gotmark, because I follow a patronymic or matronymic naming system for surnames. And then I guess I just use them for what I'm going to use them for. There are some characters that will start as throwaway and will like become part of my main.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, a throwaway character, I will try and wrap up them for what I need in a post or two posts.
Yeah, that's that's sort of what happened with Caleb Stahl in Prydania RP. He was originally intended to be a throwaway character for a few Over the Hills and Back posts, and now he's stuck around and he's being fleshed out in For the King to Valhalla. But I mean, I'm kind of happy with the spread that we got here with Tim, Goy, MJ, myself. I think we got a pretty good view of things of how RP works and what our preferences are. And I want to again thank Fiji for agreeing to be our producer on this. I'd like to thank Ghost and the Ministry of Communications and the NBS for allowing us to do this. And hopefully at some point down the line, maybe we can do this again. I don't want to rush anything, but this was a lot of fun.
Right. Same time, same place.
Really
Let's go.
But yeah, and a big thanks again to MJ, Tim, and Goy for agreeing to do here, especially MJ, because it's early goddamn morning over the UK.
It's 4:45.
MJ,
My bill is in the post.
So I'm gonna end this now so MJ can get to bed and If you guys are interested, if anyone who was listening was interested in what we were talking about and you'll want to give it a try, pop on over to the TNPRP server, pop on over to the forums, and just inquire about it. The era slot is mostly harmless. Only a few of us bite, but rest assured, we will knock the ones who bite on the nose with the newspaper until they stop. So, again, thanks to everyone who came. Thanks to everyone who listened. This has been Minister of Culture, signing off.